The Clear Signal with Steve Visscher is produced in the first instance as a radio show, and it's aired on stations around Australia. Due to music licensing restrictions, copyright-protected music tracks in this podcast edition have either been replaced with royalty-free alternatives or removed entirely.
The Clear Signal with Steve Visscher.
Well, hi everyone. Welcome back to the show. Hope you've had a great week since we last spoke. As always, it's really good to have you with us, and I hope you're looking forward to spending the hour with us here as we talk to another couple of great guests. Clearsignal.com.au is the website, of course. You can find all my contact details there, and as I always say, I'm always really happy to hear from you. And thanks to those people who've been getting in touch with me with suggestions for guests and a bit of feedback on the show. I always appreciate it. So please feel free to get in contact anytime you like. Clearsignal.com.au. Well, this week's going to be powerful. And, really powerful this week because, we're going to be taking a look at the state of the nation's electricity grid because, let's face it, that's top of mind for a lot of people these days. Electricity in Australia is very expensive and it doesn't seem to be getting any cheaper despite all the promises from our business leaders and our politicians and whatever. It just seems to keep going up, doesn't it? So you've got to wonder why that is. With the prospect of nuclear generation, of course, now being put at least into the political sphere, well, I guess that gives us something else to think about. And what role could that play were it to get up? And I know obviously there's a lot of people that have a lot of different views on that, so I thought that'd be worth exploring this week. And we'll be doing that by talking to one of Australia's foremost experts on the subject, Dr. Adi Paterson. Of course, Dr. Paterson's been in the media a lot lately talking about all of these things, and really appreciate that he's agreed to spend some time with us to talk to us here on the Clear Signal this week. Also coming up, we always outwardly gripe when, TV commercials come on or radio commercials come on. People say they're annoyed by them. But I guess, if we were really honest about it, every now and again there's a campaign that comes along, and there's been many over the years that, let's be honest, have been really pretty cool. And I could think of a few jingles here and there that have always stuck in my mind from many years and decades, in fact, particularly in radio, which, of course, is theatre of the mind. So the advertising industry, of course, is it's not only an industry in itself, but it's one that has a lot of psychology behind it. And, well, I've always found that quite fascinating. So I thought we'd take a bit of a dive into that topic in the second half hour of the show. We're going to do that with a gentleman by the name of Daz Smith. Daz has had a very long career writing ads and selling ads and doing that in all forms of media, print, of course, as well as radio and television. And I'm really looking forward to that discussion. So that'll be coming up in the second half hour. But first up, as I said, we're going to take a look at the Australian electricity sector, where it's at, why it's so expensive these days, and what role nuclear might be able to play at some point in the future if that ever did get up. And I'm just going to lay my cards on the table. I've always been a proponent of this, and I'm kind of encouraged to hear that at least it's being put up there for some discussion. We're going to talk about that with Dr. Adi Paterson. He's had a lifelong fascination, of course, with nuclear physics, and he spent over a decade at the peak of his career as the CEO of the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, better known as ANSTO. He joins us on the line now from Sydney. Adi, it's great to have you with us.
It's a real pleasure to be with you.
I have watched with great interest, Adi, your appearances in the media as the nuclear issue, the nuclear power generation issue, has sort of made its way back into the public sphere in recent times. I worry that this issue is tainted quite often by politics, and it seems to be dividing people down, one side or the other. Mm. But I think we just need to talk about some facts here. What are the pros of it? What are the cons of it? And basically compare that, I think, with the current state of Australia's power generation industry. So maybe before we do any of that, we might just talk to our audience about your career history and your qualifications in this area.
Great. Well, I got into nuclear when I was 6 years old. I got a red and yellow book called Science Can Be Fun, and I read that book avidly, and its final page says, one day we will have something called atomic power, and electricity will be, I think it said free, but I think it meant cheap, and available to everybody. And so really it is the power that comes from either putting nuclei together, which is called fusion, or breaking them apart, called fission. So I started at 6 years old. And then when I was at uni, there was a big debate in South Africa about nuclear. And I was very fortunate early in my master's program to be asked by one of the academics there to visit the Coburg nuclear power plant, which is 8.5 kilometers from the center of Cape Town.
Right, okay.
If you've been to Cape Town, you've been at the top of Table Mountain, and you go to the side of the cable car and you look out over the next to Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela was sadly incarcerated for many years. Mm-hmm. Opposite Robben Island is the nuclear power station, and you can hardly notice so, but it has a tiny footprint. Compared to other forms of power, nuclear has got what we call the highest energy density. It packs more energy because it's using the nucleus than getting rays from the sun onto a solar panel. Now, the solar photovoltaic effect was measured first by a guy called Becquerel in the 1840s. Nuclear power only became available to us after the 1940s, after the war. And so solar has been around for a long time, from the time that the Becquerel invented. In fact, the person who discovered radioactivity with Marie Curie was his grandson. And so people think of nuclear as something that is kind of been around a long time and it's unsafe. The opposite is true. It's been around a relatively short time, and it's got an amazing safety record.
Well, you mentioned there the French the design of that reactor, and I note with interest just doing some research that I think probably could we look at the French nuclear industry generally as a model for safe nuclear generation? It seems to have a pretty good record to me.
Of course, the French had great courage because they knew that they had limited coal. But they had lots of areas where they could build these compact nuclear power plants. They wouldn't affect the tourism. They wouldn't affect the wine industry. They wouldn't affect the rivers and canals. In fact, if you've ever traveled through France, as I have extensively, I think on my entire travels, I've only seen one French power reactor. And I deliberately went to see the European research reactor, which they're building in Cadarache in France. Which amazingly still today has exactly the same seismic bearings underneath it as the ones that I saw back in Coburg in 1984. So this is a mature technology. The French built 58 of them, and they have recently built their new European power reactor. So they're in the next generation.
And is that the sort of technology that we would be looking at to bring here if we were able to get this up?
My view is that the most attractive reactor for Australia at the gigawatt scale, that's the so-called big plants, but it's kind of 1.5 coal plants. A gigawatt of electricity, I think there are probably 5 or 6 sites that we could use in Eastern Australia and one in Western Australia. And that was Ziggy Switkowski's plan when I came out to Australia to run ANSTO and become the CEO there. That was a pretty sane plan, actually, and it's a great sadness that it was killed politically, because in fact today in Georgia, one of those gigawatt scale plants is operating in the United States. So I would have gone for some gigawatt scale, probably Westinghouse reactors. There is a 300 megawatt version of that reactor now, which I think is slightly bigger than the gigawatt ones because you can have 3 together in a cluster. And if one is being serviced, you get the other 2 still operating. So I would say that Westinghouse design, which is based on the original 300 megawatt combustion engineering design, the bones of that reactor were this very beautiful 300 megawatt combustion engineering reactor. That is the gold standard in my view. And if we were to, either have an AP1000 or a scaled down one to an AP300 or something in between, we have got a mature technology which goes all the way back to the second generation nuclear power plants, which is now generation 3 plus safety, generation 3 plus efficiency, generation 3 plus digital controls, and the ability to load, follow, and integrate into the grid. They are beautiful machines.
Can we just take a step back and maybe just have a look at the current state of Australia's power generation? Everywhere I look, we have a state now in South Australia that has no baseload generation.
Yeah.
Here in Victoria, where I'm coming to you from, we have still a few coal-fired thermal plants left. They're slated for closure in coming years, and there is this push towards the so-called renewables. Is this a good idea for a start to be getting rid of our baseload power? And the difference between what is baseload power and this more modern terminology that's being pushed, which is dispatchable power. Can we talk about those issues?
Look, I think this is really important. If we take wind and solar, the underlying challenge with wind is a thing called capacity factor. Wind has a 40% capacity factor. To turn that into human language, the wind blows 2 days out of 5. Okay. So nobody understands 40%, but when you say 2 days out of 5, that puts one thing in context. The other thing is the idea is we've got solar and the sun is always shining. Guess in your head, and I'll ask you the answer when I've finished what your guess is, what the solar capacity factor is for the eastern coast of Australia, and then we'll leave out South Australia and guess what it is for South Australia. So the capacity factor for solar all the way up the coast from Victoria through to the top of Queensland is lower than the capacity factor for wind.
Wow.
Now, what was the number you guessed for that one?
Well, if you said 40% for wind, I would assume it was probably somewhere more closer to maybe 20, I suppose.
Yeah, look, it's about 19.7. So you're
okay. Yeah. I mean, I live here in Victoria. I mean, we're notorious for bad weather. The sun doesn't always shine down here.
Sun doesn't always shine, and so let's say we're going to get wind 2 days out of 5. So, and sometimes they're both there together and the grid is now full of electricity. But it's not the grid we've got today. It's much bigger. Because at the moment, the grid is about, depending where you are across the eastern grid, the grid costs you between 40 and up to 60% of your cost of electrons is the grid. That is the transmission distribution system that has it. So the big grid is called the transmission system, and then you get a distribution system which takes the electricity off the big grid, and that's the smaller poles and wires, and the very small poles and wires we call the local grid. So there are 3 grids, not one grid. And the big grid, the transmission grid, is expensive and it's difficult to build, and it impacts your visual environment, and it actually can impact your life if you're too close to it. And so the transmission grid is literally the blood supply to keep you alive. Now, here's the thing. If we look at South Australia, they've had to massively increase the size of the grid in South Australia. That has made the electricity more dilute. They are using wind and solar, which is dilute and intermittent. The fundamental problem of South Australia is that they cannot produce reliable electricity.
The clear signal.
You're listening to The Clear Signal, and my very special guest this week is the former head of the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation and one of Australia's foremost experts on the subject of nuclear power, Dr. Adi Paterson. Adi, a lot of people who are really not fans of nuclear power, for whatever reason that might be, and sadly I think right at the moment it's probably because of politics, they often point to a report known as the Gen Cost report, which, if you read it on the surface at least, makes the case that nuclear power generation is in fact quite expensive. Now, you've been out there in the media disputing that for a long time and debunking it. Can you tell us what is this Gen Cost report and why do you find it inaccurate?
Basically, the report is put together by CSIRO. In the time that I was at ANSTO with good officers at Kim Carr, who was really helpful, I met at least twice with the people who wrote that report and senior people from CSIRO. At the time, and I think it's still true, the person who is the main author of that report is an economist with a master's degree, who wouldn't know a neutron if it ran him over in the street. The second main author, who I believe is still the second main author, is a wave power enthusiast. And her discipline is to go to the sea, and obviously has never been a surfer because I used to be a paddle surfer, not a paddle surfer, a body surfer. And I can tell you now, waves are not consistent. So the two people put this report together, and then they get help from engineering consultancies who are paid to answer the questions that they get asked. They are not paid to critique the report. The consultancy refuses to do anything about nuclear because that consultancy has got no nuclear capacity. And so they cherry pick some information off the web. And in particular, any reactor that is late or costs too much. But Gen cost is the cost of electricity at the fence of the facility that is producing the electricity. It ignores the grid. It ignores the cost that other people put on. It is not the cost at the meter that you and I have in our homes. So the first problem with the Gen cost report is that it does not have a nuclear baseline that is based on the published scientific literature. I have supplied them with the published scientific literature. In particular, a paper by a single author called Robert Idell, in which he demonstrates that the cost at the meter for nuclear is the lowest cost of electricity anywhere in the world. And when I say anywhere in the world, he compared Germany and Texas and their grids. Germany before it shut down its nuclear, and Texas, which has had some nuclear challenges and built a big wind grid to try to replace its nuclear power plants. And he demonstrates unequivocally, and this has never been contested, the paper has been out a number of years, he demonstrates unequivocally that nuclear is the lowest cost. Separately and independently, with a main order, a guy called Nestor Sepulveda, a genius, he gathered together a group of really smart people, and he did two scenarios, a northern grid and a southern grid. So he took two separate grids, he joined them together, and he ran each grid into separately in a big computer program with very rigorous mathematics. I've read his thesis, and put together a model to say what happens if we run 30,000 scenarios and we put them all together. Lowest cost of electricity in those two different grids, one in a colder place, one in a warmer place, fully featured, lowest cost of electricity, nuclear power. So these are two independent studies. I have spoken in the New South Wales Parliament to these two documents and to these two findings. Never had a question come back to say that there's anything wrong with the science. I think the science is beautiful and non-controvertible. At the meter for the average Australian, the cheapest way to get there for Australia is to build gigawatt and small modular reactors in appropriate places in a grid that's approximately the same size as that we have today. Grid extension is fatal. To me, it is utter madness to have validated work that is available in the public domain that unequivocally shows that nuclear is the cheapest option and that the actual plans of government are more expensive, and to maintain the notion that that is a rational debate. This is drink the Kool-Aid time, right? Or as we'd say in South Africa, suck it up, sunshine. Right. And that's what they asked us to do, suck up the sunshine. So I've got solar panels on my roof. I did the calculation for the Paterson factory. For the Paterson factory, it's appropriate for me to have solar panels on my roof 3 years ago. Put them on my roof about 2 years ago, and the New South Wales government and the electricity vendors stole my feed-in tariff from me. They reduced it by 2/3. My economics has been destroyed. Everybody who's in the same situation as me in the Sydney Basin has had their pocket picked by government with the reduction of the feed-in tariff to give money back to the people who want the big new grid.
I suppose just summarising, and because the time's sort of running a bit against us, unfortunately, but we need a supply, in my view, that's always on, that's always available. And that's something that I'm not entirely sure that the so-called renewables, dispatchable power, batteries, You talk about the Sydney Basin there. I mean, there's a lot of power being generated at the moment by their solar grid, but let's just say we had a big storm and it took out a lot of those panels. What's the effect of that?
Well, the Sydney Basin hailstorm is you lose a power station. Just quickly on batteries. Batteries are interesting. They're essentially buckets of electrons. The known life of the current generation of lithium batteries, which the National Renewable Energy Lab in the States has actually validated, is 9.8 years. So no matter what you do with the batteries over the life of a nuclear power plant, which is, say, minimum 50 years, you're going to replace your batteries 5 times. Lithium is not your friend. Lithium is a scarce material. We happen to be a world leader in providing it to the world. The batteries are not recyclable at this point. They're working very hard to try to make that work. And their energy density is low. So you've got big buckets of 10-year electrons in batteries that would be far better off if you want to have them in vehicles, put them in vehicles, don't put them on slabs. And basically, at the moment, about once every 3 months, there is a major lithium battery fire. They had one in a factory in Korea recently. A number of people managed to escape with their lives. You do not want to try to put out a lithium battery fire. By the way, if you have one, get out of there. Lithium fumes will kill you. You know, we're picking deadly, unreliable, expensive forms of energy. And it's my sincere hope that nuclear, which is the best, lowest cost, safest, cheapest at the meter of the home form of energy in the world, that we will overcome this irrational ban.
And just one more topic, I suppose, a lot of people bring up, Adi, is the issue of what do we do with the waste? A lot of people are concerned about that, and that's a valid concern, I think. So how do we deal with the waste?
So the first thing is, when I got to ANSTO, everybody was worried about the nuclear medicine waste. I took the Synrock program from a group of researchers trying to find better types of Synrock to a plant that is ready to run, that will be able to take all of the nuclear medicine waste from all of the nuclear medicine production in Australia and put it into canisters about that big. And those canisters, you can directionally drill into the earth for 1 kilometre, backfill it with cement, and that waste problem for Australia, for our nuclear medicine, is solved. I solved that because I committed to Ziggy Switkowski on the second day that I was in Australia that I would make Synrock work. The current government has not funded the startup of that plant. That is obnoxious in my view. There's a waste solution that we could all celebrate for all of our nuclear waste from the production of nuclear medicine for the entire lifetime. And the current government won't start the plant that will do that. They don't want a waste plant to work. Shockingly bad. Now, for the rest of the waste, there's a repository in the country of Finland, which is open and where they've done their test run, where they've done all the dummy runs and so on. All of the waste for the current and historical reactors in Finland can go into that 300-meter deep, granite, top to bottom, nuclear waste facility, and they can put the waste all in there, and it can be done economically within the cost they pay for their electricity. So it is not true that there is no solution. There are many political barriers because, as I've just explained to you, many politicians don't want there to be a solution. The French have got a range of solutions. It's not widely known, but all of the low and medium level waste, intermediate level waste is processed in France. In fact, all of the intermediate level waste from the HIFI reactor, 3 canisters, I think there's two or three canisters. One was certainly there when I was at ANSTO, are already back at ANSTO. You can stand next to those canisters and give them a hug. And the intermediate level is in there. I've had lots of politicians, both sides, coming to hug the canisters, right? But they never got onto the front page. That could be put on the back of a trailer, and it could be taken to the repository in WA, which exists, which has been set up. It's a private sector waste repository. It's currently licensed for all of our low-level waste that we ever can think of in Australia can get into that hole of the ground already there in Western Australia. And in my view, there would be no barrier to the intermediate level waste that is in those containers to go into the same facility. And as I say, Synrock has got a waste solution. Waste solutions are a political problem, not a science and technology problem.
You know what? I think we're going to have another discussion and another interview, Adi, because there's so many more things we could talk about. But I think, sadly, it all comes down to politics. And I think if the opposition were to become the government, I think even with their policy, they're going to face a rather significant struggle to get this up. Now, I personally hope they do manage to get it up. I've always been out there and saying that I'm in favour of it, but we will see how that goes. Dr. Adi Paterson, it's been a privilege to speak with you. I hope we can do it again, and thanks so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Ahead on the Clear Signal, perhaps somewhat ironically after the break, we're going to be discussing the psychology of advertising with Daz Smith. Stick around, folks. We'll be right back.
You're listening to The Clear Signal.
Yeah, it's great to have you with us in this second half hour of the program. I tell you what, wasn't that a great chat with Dr. Adi Paterson? Whether you, perhaps are concerned about nuclear power, as I said before, or perhaps I don't really know much about it. I think it's always good when something like this comes into the public realm that there's lots of good communication going on about it. Pros, cons, and all that sort of stuff. Obviously, Dr. Paterson is quite well on the pro side of it, and as I said in that interview, I put my hand up, and so am I. But I also get that people have different views, so certainly drop me a line, steve@clearsignal.com.au, if you have any thoughts on that, and if people have different thoughts, and perhaps you can suggest a guest to me who might, come from the different side of that argument, then I'd be more than happy to have them on the show here. So certainly do get in touch. But I tell you what, it's all about communication, and I suppose one of the oldest forms of media communication that I could think of is advertising. It's something that's been around all sorts of media for a long time, and it's something that's really fascinated me. Somebody who's worked a long career in the advertising game is Daz Smith, and I thought we'd have him in today to have a bit of a chat about his career in the advertising game and tell us a little bit about how that works. Daz, welcome to the studio. Great to have you here.
Hey, great to be part of the show, Steve, and thank you for the invite into your studio. It's great to be here.
I must say, mate, now I've been around to your studio at the Buzzz several times, and I do have a little bit of studio envy because it's a lot neater and tidier than this, but it's great to have you here with us.
It's fantastic. I guess, you spend so much time in the studio that it becomes almost like your new lounging area, and I spend a lot of hours in my studio, so I want it to be as comfortable. All I need is like someone to come and give me a foot massage every day, and it would just be absolutely perfect, Steve.
I tell you what, it is nice to have this version of a man cave here, and it's interesting, isn't it? We might just talk about this a bit later too, about the idea of how broadcasting has changed, because we do all of this sort of radio work now from home studios, which is certainly a departure from times past. But what I really wanted to talk to you about today was advertising, and you've had a long history in advertising, as I mentioned, and I just wonder what you think about the way it is these days. I wonder first up, do you think it's changed the way advertising works these days, or is it, it's kind of a concept that's been around forever and maybe some things always stay the same?
I think it's very much that way, that things will always remain the same if you're keeping to the core basics and principles of what advertising is really meant to be. I think we can tend to try and tweak things a little too much, and the more things get tweaked, I think the more we tend to go away from what the basics are, and that's about looking after the customer and finding out what your customer or client really wants, regardless of what you need. And I guess, that's where the success of advertising, I found, always came easily in a way to me, because it was all about the customer first. So I don't think that would have changed too much. I've been out of direct advertising for a little while now, but I would imagine if I jump back into that industry again, that if you are looking after your client, listening more than talking, putting some really good solid ideas in front of your client that's going to benefit them, and they see some benefit from that, then it wouldn't be too different than what it would have been when I was at the top of my game in advertising years ago.
So we talk about years ago. What is your history in the game of in the trade of advertising?
Yeah, I guess sales has always been something that's been part of my career path, Steve, and advertising is something that I really glued to when I was first exposed to it, and probably from a business point of view, just having some exposure to the advertising part of the business, regardless where I was. But I guess the first real serious role in advertising came when I spent some time with Prime TV, which was in a regional area. It was the Channel 7 network up in the regions, and you really got a good understanding of selling on value versus price, because with TV in particular, a very expensive form of advertising, if you're not getting a return, everything is deemed expensive if you're not getting a return from it. So it really gave me a good insight into exactly how advertising works with businesses and getting those results, because I always used to say, like, it's very easy to get your first order. It's very difficult to get your second one. So that's going to be based on just how well that first campaign went. So Prime gave me that first exposure to advertising, which ultimately led to other forms of media as well down the track. But it was really TV that got me started, and it's probably one of the toughest forms of advertising you can be involved with as a salesperson.
And I suppose that really comes down to targeting too. I know my wife, she originally she grew up in a regional area here in northern Victoria, and one of the things she quite often talks about is, seeing TV, noticing the difference in TV advertising when she came to Melbourne, because, when you're in a rural area, you're getting, rural advertising, you're getting stuff that's targeted, ads for sheep dip and fertiliser and stuff like that. You wouldn't see that sort of advertising down here in the capital city markets.
It's really interesting. It's understanding what your client really needs to get out of any given campaign. And some campaigns were quite easy to put together. It might have been a sale that was coming on a weekend. You see quite often a car dealership wanting to move a whole heap of stock out over a weekend. So call to action campaigns were pretty easy to sort of put together, because it was hit it hard and hit it frequently, and then you would tend to get some results from that, depending on the budget that they were prepared to spend. But the longer term campaigns are the one that are really hard to monitor and really hard to really gauge, unless they are the customer themselves are actually spending the time to monitor where that feedback and where the clients are coming from. And in my experience, Stephen, it probably still hasn't changed, that most businesses, when they are doing any form of advertising, are failing to record where their leads are coming from. So, I guess we'll talk about my print advertising background a little later on in the chat. But if you're not monitoring, then regardless of the type of campaign you're running, it's very difficult to understand whether you're getting benefit from it or not.
You would think too that, a potential advertising client would really want to know that sort of information. I kind of find that interesting that they wouldn't follow up that way. I suppose a lot of that comes down to the psychology around setting up advertising. I was going to talk about the psychology of it from a consumer point of view, but I guess just thinking about it there, it's also from a client point of view.
Absolutely. It needs to be, there needs to be benefit seen all round. And if, I think there's a lot of sales guys, and I'm not sure whether the cowboys still exist. There was certainly around when I was selling full time. It's became more about what was in it for them, and that's where KPIs and targets play a real important role in the type of salesperson you are. If you can get caught up in the back end stuff from a salesman point of view, then you tend to lose sight a little bit, or you can lose sight of exactly what the benefit is to the consumer or to the customer, because it needs to be the more that the customer spends, the more the consumer then is happy, the more he's going to spend back with you again. So that cycle can continue if all parties are engaged and seeing some sort of a result.
We often talk about radio and I guess television being theatre of the mind pretty much, but I mean, there's lots of different ways that ads are presented to people. I'm interested in the psychology behind using music and jingles and the way that might influence customers or consumers, and then versus spoken word advertising, because I think each has their place, and it's a matter of trying to work out how you target that to a market and how you target it to the needs of the client.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what the product is or the service is you're trying to sell and promote, Steve. I've written a lot of radio ads. I've been involved with a lot of production for TV commercials as well. And there are some that really fit that need for a music bed. There are others that just the word only is like a raw read or suit the client a lot better. And I think you just got to sit back and listen to the client, voice what you need to have voice if you're doing the voiceover yourself, or wait for that voiceover script to come back and then work out whether it needs that music better or not, because sometimes it can actually be a distraction, and other times it can actually hook the listener in.
There's always one that's always sort of stuck in my mind, and I'm going to play this one to you, Daz, because it goes back to the mid-1980s. That's how good it was. There's some of these ad campaigns that stick in people's minds, and this insurance company does not exist anymore. But I just play this one to you and what you think about the theatre of the mind.
Mate, it's blowing a gale on the bay and your flash new Rambo 3 windsurfer's cracking at Brazilian knots and fair dinkum. You're having the best time of your life.
Jeez, I'm having the best time of my life.
Unfortunately, you haven't noticed the 60-foot killer tidal wave which has hit you at twice the speed of sound and moments later bunged you through the window of a disused stockbroker's office. Halfway up the Rialto building with multiple fractures and some nasty carpet burn on both knees.
Oh, jeez, just when I was having the best time of my life.
Of course, naturally, you've copped A&A private health cover the moment you left school, right?
Oh, no, I thought the old man's
Won't
insurance.
cover you after you left school. You've got to have your
Oh,
own.
this is the worst day of my life.
Nah, look, we're only kidding. Melbourne doesn't have tidal waves anyway, you dill.
Oh, jeez, radio's marvellous.
No worries, but get on.
Well, I
the
hope
phone
Melbourne doesn't
line
have tidal waves. You know, that one has always stuck in my mind. I find it hilarious, that ad, and that's from about 1986. But there are some ads that are so well written. That one there is a good one of creating a picture in someone's mind, and there's obviously a business attached to that. But I don't know, what do you think of an ad like that?
Storytelling is an art in itself, isn't it, really? And I found I had forgotten that ad completely, Steve, so thanks for taking me back a trip down memory lane together. It was lovely. I was caught in the moment then. It actually pulled me back to where they were. So it was a brilliant ad for being able to put you as part of the crew that are part of this ad itself. So I think, worked exceptionally well.
And there are the other devices they use, like characters. I remember another insurance company, maybe insurance people are really gifted for this, I don't know, but there was a company that come down to Victoria from Sydney back in the 90s, and they were trying to sell their insurance products, and there was a character they created who was an insurance nerd by the name of Wallace Fairweather. I don't have any clips. I can't find any clips of Wallace Fairweather, but they were so funny, and it sticks in your mind. There's other people here like the tile guy, Frank Walker, hello. There is people that can just manage to pull that off, and there are others that are completely forgettable.
It's interesting you use the word stick in your mind, because we used to use the terminology create your ads that remain sticky. And they are sticky because they do stick in your mind. They are very hard to forget, and that's what makes a really good ad. If you hear a jingle, and jingles in particular are the ones that will remain with you, but there are also catch phrases like "Not Happy Jan," which is probably one of the most favourite, talking about the old days of Yellow Pages. But that is an ad that continually comes up, even all these years later, because it was a sticky phrase that people, maybe you want to forget it.
Yeah.
But they were still great ads as well. They really got the message out there for Yellow.
So how do you morph that sort of psychology into print? You talked about having a background in print advertising. Is it the same sort of principles you would use there, but in obviously a different way? It's
difficult to create a picture with a client when selling into Yellow Pages. I mean, I was at Yellow Pages at a time when it was probably it reached its peak and was on the downside. I was in the Gold Coast office, and I'm quite proud to say that the Gold Coast office was the number one Yellow Pages office in the country. Australia was the number one Yellow Pages selling country in the world. So we kind of unofficially branded ourselves the number one Yellow Pages team in the world. And it probably wasn't too far off the mark, because we had an exceptional bunch of salespeople there that I learnt from when I started, and also involved with mentoring others when they come through. It was one of those roles that I had that I just instantly connected with, and even though I had done sales and I had been involved with advertising. The greatest challenge, I think there's two greatest challenges came when I was with Yellow Pages was when the global financial crisis hit, and the Gold Coast was probably one of the last cities in the country to feel the effect. So we saw it coming, and then the whole nature of the business changed. The other thing that impacted greatly was this little thing that came along, which became the thorn in our side. It was called Google. You might have heard of it.
Oh, yes, I've heard of them.
And then Google popped along, and it became this option. But what happened with Google and customers is that they didn't fully understand it. So whilst they had Yellow Pages and were able to create stories and create pictures in their mind of what a Yellow Pages ad could do to them, because it had always worked for them, that this Google thing came along and all of a sudden it was another option for them, but they didn't understand it. So we played on that quite a bit, that if you don't understand how it works, then how can you invest all your money there? Unless you know with Yellow Pages, for all these years, it has been your partner that has generated revenue for you. So it became a lot more difficult to start creating stories and painting pictures in their mind of what their ad could do for their business when there was a serious, and we didn't know at that stage just how serious, but a serious competitor coming into the market, which now we see exactly what happened. It was probably, perhaps the final nail in the coffin of Yellow Pages as a business.
Times really have changed, and advertising itself has changed too. So, I suppose, people who are in that business really have to adapt along with everybody else through the technology of the time.
It was really interesting regarding newspapers, the commute in on a train in the morning that everybody had their papers up and you wouldn't see faces because we were just buried in the Herald Sun or the Age or whatever newspaper you're reading. And then in the afternoons, it may have been more of an iPad or a phone, and then over a period of time, then the newspapers, just, as you said, disappeared and people were just staring into their phones. I was able to witness that doing a lot of commuting on the train, heading in to corporate offices, especially in Melbourne, that you saw a lot of that happening. Now it's just all phones. I mean, if you saw someone with a newspaper, I think they would get the strangest look. Where did you pick up that bit of paper?
Yeah, what are you doing with it?
The Clear Signal.
You're listening to The Clear Signal. Daz Smith is with me. We're talking about advertising and we're talking about radio. Daz, we talked about older technologies a bit earlier, about the Yellow Pages. We probably should point out to our younger listeners, that was actually a telephone book, which you probably aren't familiar with these days either. But Daz, I want to talk to you about something else too, because you've actually entered another adaptation or another evolution of technology, and that is in radio. You've entered the streaming radio market. So, we're talking about advertising itself is sort of moving on, but radio is starting to move too. But I wonder, do you consider yourself an early adopter?
I guess so, in a way. I hadn't really ever thought of it that way, Steve. I mean, I got involved with streaming radio back in 2016 after doing my stint at commercial radio and also being around advertising in radio. So radio had been part of my life for a long time anyway. And I was out doing regional commercial stuff and moved back to the Gold Coast and figured that I'd just get back on air on the Gold Coast. And it didn't happen because even ex-commercial jocks had moved to the Gold Coast, retired, were prepared to go to community radio stations and be on air for free. Yep. So there was a long waiting list to get on at any station. And I really found that was a massive void in my life, that I didn't have radio. So I don't know, I really can't recall, we're going back a while now, but I can't really recall how the idea came up and why I decided to do it. But I needed it in my life. And I thought, if I can't be involved with somebody else's radio, I will create my own station. And that's how the station came about, with a lot of research and setting it up. And I guess back in 2016, it was early on then. There's a lot more streaming stations now. And I guess part of the conversation that I have when I'm selling advertising onto the station is that what is your frequency? And I think, well, when was the last time you walked into your home and then set your wireless to a frequency? We are all streaming now. Yep. And even the big commercial networks will push you through to their streaming platforms before they'll expect you to dial into their frequency. So those days of having to have a frequency, even though it's kind of sexy to have a frequency against your station, when was the last time that you dialed into 101 point whatever? Yeah, well, that's true. And I mean, with the advent of digital radio, people wouldn't even know what the freak is now, would they? Yep. They would just, it just comes up on the screen. I'm listening to XYZ station and there it is. It's interesting because being an early adopter myself of so-called new media, I entered podcasting in about 2008. And not a lot of people really knew what podcasting was then. So when we decided to frame our show as if it were a radio show, then we would go out and look for guests. And we were talking about business leaders, politicians, that type of thing, who receive a lot of media training themselves. They're sort of taught how to deal with journos and radio presenters. When you would say to them it's a podcast, a lot of them would just look at you blankly and say, well, what is it? You'd have to say, it's a radio show. Oh, it's radio. Okay, because we understand that. So I get where you're coming from there, because it's hard to be an early adopter in a market. I know with streaming radio, I quite often travel over to the United States and it's far more accepted there. It's becoming more mainstream. You're starting to see channels like Sirius XM, for example, where their app is actually inbuilt into car head units now. So Australia is sort of lagging behind that technology by a decade perhaps. Do you think we'll come to a time where we will see that? I think so. I think it's inevitable that happens. I used to get a little frustrated, but also have a side smirk when I would talk to people about my station, and they would treat it as that's a nice hobby. But it was never designed to be a hobby.
Yeah.
And it was never designed, my station, to be something that I would be able to retire to Florida over either. It was designed because it was a passion of mine, and it remains a passion of mine. And it got me through, like it did with a lot of people that I have connections with, got me through some tough times through lockdowns, in particularly here in Melbourne, that whilst we're unable to go out and be busy in things we would normally be busy in, I could invest a whole heap of time and effort and passion into building the station. I wanted to make my station sound as commercial as I could without becoming too commercial, because I think a lot of commercial stations, in my view, have sort of lost their way a little bit, that have become so much more syndicated and so much more saturated with advertising, which they need, and I get that because I'm an advertising person, that you tend to lose what that spirit of the station was about. For me, listening to some of the big boys now, and I do listen from time to time to get a bit of a feel for where they're playing in the market, that it's not the same as what it used to be. So I try and keep true to what I wanted my station to be, with still advertising that needs to be there, because you still need to be able to pay to run a station. It doesn't come for free. It's people are thinking that you can start up your own online station and you're going to get instant benefit. It's cost you nothing. Well, you're in for a rude awakening, but it's just enough to be able to keep it viable, to keep that passion in my life, and to have me constantly involved in a medium that I love so much.
And I mean, the thing is too, when you're looking at making a program such as this, I was really gratified. The first 3 stations that took this program, including yours at the Buzzz there, were all streaming stations. And I really appreciate that. And it appeals to me too, because I've been an early adopter in a similar sort of, technology or broadcast medium. So I really appreciate that.
It's really important to note too, Steve, that the show, The Clear Signal, is a great addition to the Buzzz. And whilst a lot of streaming stations are very similar to community radio stations, where you'll just be completely flooded with a whole heap of different type of shows through a day. You'll jump from Spanish to top 40 to rock and roll, and then back to a whatever. I wanted to keep a music station and keep the quality programs in. Generally are on after 6 o'clock at night. So it's all music through the day. Saturday is the day where there's some really good talk stuff going on there. And Saturday mornings has been a great opportunity to invite you on and be part of the station as well, because it adds what I needed it to add on a Saturday morning listen when people are in the car or they're at home with the radio on, and there's some real positive feedback coming back. So it's been a great addition. I love the show. It's gone up another rank now because of the quality of guests you've got on right now. But
of course.
It's brilliant because we get to hear some wonderful stories, and you've had some terrific guests on. I feel like I'm in super company.
Oh, yeah, it's great. And I really appreciate it. People should know too that Daz was really instrumental in helping me get this program off the ground. So it's a real privilege to have it playing on your station. I also want to acknowledge stations like 2DD and Liquid Radio, Snowy Mountains, and other streaming station. And of course, we've got community stations playing too. And the interesting thing I find about not only community stations, I suppose, but even the big boys too, Daz, is that they are now starting to have their own streamers on their websites and stuff. So, whether I found this with podcasting, traditional media didn't want a bar of us at the start. And I get that. I understand why that is. It's a disrupting influence, but we are seeing now that not only are we seeing bigger and more mainstream radio stations starting to stream as well, we are also seeing people from that area of media come into podcasting, which I find kind of gratifying.
Well, there was an old saying that happened years ago, and I came across it, that it's almost like radio announcers' playground. You get to do stuff in the playground that you don't get to do in the workplace or in the schoolroom, all right? So they get to play a little bit more in the sandpit, and there's a lot less rules around that, and they've got a little bit more leniency around it as well. And, listen to some of the real quality radio guys that have their own podcast now that have huge listener base. But it's not the same as what you would have heard on the station, which is more of a cleaner. It needs to be a cleaner version as well, being on a commercial network. But to get into podcasting and have a play, it can really let your hair down. And listen to some of those guys true personalities come out by being able to be themselves more than what they're allowed to be on a network.
Yeah, for true. I just wish some of them wouldn't work blue. I just don't see the need for that. But that might just be me being a grumpy old conservative. Daz Smith, it's been so good to have you here in the studio. I'm really happy you came to see my studio because, like I said at the top, I've been to yours a few times. So every time I come back from there, I think, gee whiz, I need to clean mine up a little bit. It's great to have you here with us, mate. Thanks so much for your time today.
Steve, it's been an absolute pleasure and honour, and look forward to all the continuing great work from the Clear Signal. Thanks.
And that just about wraps up the show for this week. Boy, it's been a busy one and lots of great information in there as well. Thanks to Daz Smith for joining us. Thanks also, of course, to Dr. Adi Paterson for coming in and talking to us about nuclear power generation as well. Really enjoyed that one. And thanks, of course, to you for being with us. We'll be back next week with more of the Clear Signal. Look forward to seeing you then. Until then, stay safe, be happy, and we'll see you again soon.
Get in touch. Join the conversation. Find us online at clearsignal.com.au.
Southern Skies Media.